is that you want people to do. So that's sort of your general thing. And in this particular circumstance, it's not on my bio, but I'm doing a book called Fevered, and it's going to come out next fall, and it's being published by Rodale, who's Al Gore's publisher, and it's called Fevered, How a Warmer, Hotter Planet Will Make Us Sick, and How We Can Save Ourselves. So what it's about, my book, is about how climate change is going to affect our health. And, each different chapter unpacks a different element. The spread of infectious diseases as the weather gets hotter and ecosystems change, increasingly frequent and hotter heat waves and forest fires. That was another chapter. Another chapter was on worsening air quality. And then the chapter that I'm going to sort of unpack for you and how I put this together is the effects of extreme weather events on the public health system and healthcare delivery. And that's a lot of gobbledygook, but what it means is that, after extreme weather events, people are sicker and they have higher rates of mortality. And I don't know if you guys got the chapter I sent yesterday. You're welcome to read it at your leisure. I highlighted, the parts that I'll be going over today, but, suicide rates doubled after Katrina, et cetera, and it really impacted the public health system. The second thing, and this is really important, who's your audience? Because that's going to dictate the stories that you tell. You have different audiences, you're going to be telling different stories because you want this to be meaningful to the people that you're trying to reach. So the stories that you tell are really, really important. You have to be very, very careful. And, I sort of went through, sort of a training by fire because I used to work for the women's magazines a lot, which I don't mercifully anymore, but they're very, very specific about, what they want. They want somebody between the ages of 20 and 30, college educated. Sometimes I think that they want, green salamanders that are, it would be so prescriptive. But you really have to keep that in mind. Who is your audience? For this book, when people think about climate change, they think, not so much anymore. I have to tell you, just to sort of digress a little bit, I kind of had to rewrite the book this summer because, climate change is sort of caught up with what's going on. But when I was writing the book, it was still sort of out in the future. But when people think about climate change, they will think it will mostly affect poor people in impoverished nations, and that the worst effects won't kick in until long after many of us, or at least me, have met our final reward. And as we're starting to realize that actually is not the case. And I want this book to be read by the average American reader. And environmentalists to be sure, but I don't want to be just preaching to the choir. I want average Americans to understand that this impacts them and to also package some solutions. But that's something that I do in my work. You may not want to do it in this. All right, and the other piece of this is what message do you want to come across? Because that's also going to impact, because I'm starting to, sort of zero in on the stories that I told in here that illuminated the points that I'm trying to bring out. So what message do you want to get across? That's essentially the message. That climate change is real, it's happening right here and right now across the United States, and not even the very affluent are going to be insulated from its effects. As one of my sources, one of the doctors down in New Orleans said, this was a great leveler. Having money didn't protect you. Just sort of, parenthetically, and it was something I didn't include in the chapter because I couldn't verify it myself, but, one story I heard is, after Katrina hit, well, the city was leveled. A lot of businesses went out of business. This is stuff that, is when you start to think about it, it's basic common sense, but you don't think about it. So people lost their health insurance. What happens then? There was a woman whose husband was being treated for cancer at MD Anderson, and he was in the middle of cancer treatments, and he suddenly lost his health insurance. This is, affluent people who had a very big house. She ended up having to mortgage the house that was decimated. I could go on and on. She's now living with her son. The husband died. She's absolutely penniless. She's in her 60s. She has a master's degree. I could go on and on, but you get the picture. And this was just one example. As I said, I didn't use it in the chapter because I couldn't really verify it, but that'll give you an idea of the kind of stories that I was looking for. All right, what what stories will illuminate the message that I'm trying to get across? For me, I wanted to be sure that my stories were about people that the readers could relate to. Who reads? Obviously you're going to have an educated population. I also wanted to be sure I included a diverse range of voices. When we think about Hurricane Katrina, we think of mainly of impoverished African Americans sitting desperate on rooftops waiting to be rescued. But that was only a very small part of the story. People from every strata and social class were profoundly affected. And that's the point I wanted to hammer home. And the other piece of this is try and find stories that are fresh. Don't use just the typical shop-worn stories. Look for elements of surprise and freshness. You never know what part of your message is going to stay with your intended audience or what will catch their attention. Tell me something I haven't heard before. A couple of other important points, and I'll get into basic interviewing techniques a little later. Could somebody give me like a time check when it's like 20 to 5? And if I'm not done, then I'll just stop and I'll do interviewing techniques and stuff. Okay. A couple other important points, and this is really critical, and something I realized over the years. Not everybody's a good interview. I remember I interviewed Robert Kahn, who actually did invent the internet. Sorry, Al Gore. The genesis of the internet, just FYI, I used to work at Omni a million years ago, a great magazine, first it was a military, through the Defense Department, they wanted to build an early warning network in case of a war, and then they had a test bed down at UCLA, and that's really actually where the internet started. Anyway, to cut to the chase, I interviewed Robert Kahn, and he was one of the architects of these test beds that was a forerunner and ultimately became the internet. He is, without a doubt, the worst interview I've ever had in my entire life. He was an engineer. He really didn't want to be interviewed. I had bugged him. I said, and really in the middle of the interview, I finally said to him, I said, why did you do this? He says, because you were so persistent. So that's interesting. But he really was the worst interview. I mean, he gave me monosyllabic answers. It was really awesome. But the reason I bring this up, because then on the other side of the equation is, and these are the people that are just gold mines, and you never know when you're going to find them. They're just natural-born storytellers. You turn them on, and they start, all you have to do is be a stenographer, and and there was a couple people in this chapter who turned out to be natural-born storytellers. They were just wonderful. And I would say there was 2 that were natural-born storytellers, and there was 3 that were good storytellers. But Billy Shanks, I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at it, but you'll go look at it later, who was the firefighter. I mean, all I had to do was press a button. And I mean, it was just a matter of trying to pick through, which story to be. I couldn't let him be the whole chapter. But he was so wonderful. I mean, he was just, he's one of these guys that just radiates goodness from every molecule. Fire captain. He's his wife is ill. He's very protective of her. They have 2 adopted children that were foster children. He said that he picked being a fire chief in a less good neighborhood because he wanted to. It just goes on and on. You get the picture. He's just a really good soul. So that's just something to think about. And as I said, you have to kiss a lot of frogs to find your prince or princess. And for the chapter, I interviewed a lot of people. I interviewed maybe 20 to 30 people, and only maybe 10 or 12 voices got into the chapter. So is there any questions so far before I sort of dive in sort of how I did all of this? Okay. All right. So moving on. So when I first did this, I wanted to illuminate a chapter on how extreme weather events impact us health-wise. And what I wanted to show is that, you have the hurricane or you have the flood, and then, the media leaves, and people are having to clean up the mess, and it's either better or worse, but they have to live with it. And sort of a minor example is, in Joplin, Missouri, when they had those tornadoes, and, the hospitals all have their disaster drills, but the tornado lifted the roof off the hospital, so that had to be rebuilt. And I wanted to look at Katrina as sort of a cautionary tale. And everybody looks at this horrible disaster, and, George Bush was incompetent, and everybody was poor, Katrina in New Orleans, and this will never happen again. Well, actually, I did a lot of investigation. George Bush wasn't incompetent. Shock, but true. True. Actually, New Orleans is actually a pretty well-off neighborhood. It was just that the people who didn't evacuate were the poor people for obvious reasons. It's another duh. But most people did evacuate. There was only maybe 100,000 people that were left behind, and 1.3 million people did evacuate. And the city was completely flattened. It's 7 years later. I was there in June. The public health system has still not recovered. And this can happen again in any other major city. It can happen in Miami. It can happen in Houston. It can, not only can, it will. So I wanted to sort of unpack this and use this as kind of a cautionary tale. So that kind of, is sort of the background as to why I decided to, go down to New Orleans, take a look at what had happened. The other piece of this, and just sort of pulling back, and I don't know how this relates to the kind of work that you guys do, but nothing takes the place of meeting people in person. Nothing. Anytime I come back from these reporting trips, I'm always struck by that. You just get so much more when you meet people in person. I always talk about this, and maybe this joke will kind of not work anymore, but, you have the interview and then you have the cigarette after. This is an old joke. So, because nobody smokes anymore, but it used to be. But in any event, because what it is that people are comfortable with you now, and they kind of let their hair down, and then you get the real story, which is all off the record, but it enables you to write with authority. I mean, it's just like with Billy. I ended up talking to Billy a lot. I mean, he was just, I couldn't get him off the phone. He was fabulous. And then when we went there, it just pours out of him, and I call him back, And I used maybe 10% of it. But it really, when I wrote the story, I was able to write with real authority because of everything he told me and the other people that he told me. So anyway, the first pass is that, you sort of read magazine articles, you sort of steep yourself, to sort of get the background information. And there were 2 doctors that I did, actually 3 doctors that I did pre-interviews with who've been, sort of leaders and had been interviewed by the media a lot. And I could see when I went to interview them why they had been interviewed by the media a lot, because natural-born storytellers, and that was Peter DeBlois and Ben DeBlois. I mean, they're probably the people who are most noted, in terms of, and they were 2 of the doctors that were trapped in Charity Hospital. And I don't know if you remember, but Sanjay Gupta finally got through to them because they were never evacuated. I mean, they were just sort of forgotten. And they finally, were evacuated about 4 days later. And it's a very dramatic story about what happened to Charity Hospital. And it's just, it's beyond comprehension what they did in this hospital. I mean, if you can imagine an intensive care unit or an emergency room without any electricity. I mean, just think about that. I mean, they don't have respirators. They had to do all of this stuff by hand, and they had the people who weren't evacuated were the sickest of the sick. So I knew for sure that I wanted to interview them. And then, I did a literature search, and there were some other very interesting people. Another doctor, Ruth Berggren, who had been at Charity. She wasn't in New Orleans anymore, so I did a pre-interview with her. So and then I was interviewing Karen DeSalvo, who was the health commissioner. So these are obvious, right? And then I also set up an interview with Richard Dykman. And he had written a book called Code Blue about his experiences. So I set up interviews with all these people. These are sort of the obvious people, right? And by the way, Richard Dykman, very nice man, not a good interview. Not that he didn't want to be, but he's just not a storyteller. I mean, either you are or you aren't. Some people are, some people aren't. So I had this all set up. So 2 weeks before the trip, I realized, well, all you're interviewing are doctors. I mean, this isn't going to work. So I'm going, oh my God, what am I going to do? I'm leaving in 2 weeks. I've got to get some real voices in here. So I sent out an email blast. to everybody on my email list, and I posted something on Facebook, and I was just inundated with responses. I got about 40 responses, and I sifted through all the responses, and because I had so many responses, I was able to sort of pick and choose, who I wanted to talk to and who I didn't. But I wanted to have diverse voices, and I also wanted to interview, forgive me, middle-class people. That was my audience, so that's who I wanted in this book. We've had all the interviews already with Katrina about the poor people who didn't evacuate. I wanted to talk to the people who did evacuate, and what happened to their lives, and what happened, how they tried to rebuild. So that was, number one criteria. The second criteria was that I wanted to have somebody who had a chronic illness. Because managing a chronic illness and with this kind of dislocation, that also illuminates. So I wanted that. Then I wanted, middle-class African-American voices. Because when you think of Katrina, you think of, the poor black people. There's a lot of not poor black people that live in New Orleans too, and those are the readers. In addition, I wanted to get first responders. So this was sort of my criteria, and so I ended up after having following up on a lot of leads and doing a lot of pre-interviews before I came down. I ended up settling on the doctors that I mentioned, and then Peter DeBlow, Ben DeBoisblanc, and then Karen DeSalvo, and then also I mentioned Richard Dykeman, but he was just okay. He wanted to be more than okay, but he is who he is. But then I found Sergio Hassani, and that was from my email blast. He no longer lives in New Orleans, but he was a doctor that volunteered her services at the Superdome. So I was able to get snapshots of the Superdome. Plus, he was living in New Orleans with his girlfriend, who had just finished up her PhD. This is my readers. He was a pathologist, she has her PhD, this is my readers. I wanted to get their story and what happened to them. They lost everything. They lost everything. They evacuated with their dog, and that was it. Thank God they saved the dog. But, so this is somebody I found through the email blast, a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend. So that was one person. And then when I went to New Orleans, I found Billy, who was the firefighter, who I couldn't get off the phone. I love Billy. And then Felice Guimont, who was, she turned out to, I thought I was getting a threefer for her. She's African-American, she's middle class, she's has a chronic illness. And then, well, actually, she turned out to be a fiver. She's also a nurse and a musician, and her family was from the lower Ninth Ward. So I was able to include that whole section too, because I didn't know this, but you heard a lot about the lower Ninth Ward, and Brad Pitt is building houses down there and stuff. And of course, when I was in New Orleans, I went to the lower Ninth Ward, and what I discovered is that the lower Ninth Ward is this very middle-class community, or it was. It's sort of like Ladera Heights. It was actually a very lovely neighborhood that was completely flattened, and it turned out that she grew up there, and her family had lived there for 50 years. Her parents had gotten completely displaced. Her entire family had gotten, and she's a highly educated professional. Her son, as she said, was finishing up his master's degree. You get the picture. So she ended up being this, and then when I got down there, she was even something else, which was sort of this dividend, but you never know. You never know people. So those are the people that I ended up focusing on, but I did it through an email blast, and then I sifted through. Before I went down there, I kind of pre-interviewed people, and there were some people that were very nice, didn't have much of a story, and there was other people like Billy who turned out to be really quite wonderful. So that's basically how I settled on the people that but you could see that all of these people in different ways illuminated the story that I was trying to tell. Is there any questions so far? Am I losing anybody here? Okay. All right. I don't know if you guys got the thing that I sent in the mail. No, or I had sent the chapter. No.
It's one of the chapters from her book. It's on the transfer file.
But I wanted to sort of go over some of the stories that I used in here. Did anybody get a chance to look at them? No. Okay. All right. We'll make this one. Anyway, so I sort of opened, with the story of what happened to Big Charity. Big Charity was the charity hospital that I'm talking about, and it was really sort of a very dramatic story about how, because as you know, it wasn't Katrina, it was the failure of the levees that really did everything. And, I sort of set the picture, of Charity Hospital and what happened there. And, I discovered that they had like these hurricane teams. You could volunteer to cover the hurricane. I mean, this is how used they are to hurricanes. You could volunteer to cover the hurricane. You work for 3 days straight, and then you're off for a week. And when the hurricane's over, everybody goes down to the local bar and gets drunk. I mean, it was just, this whole thing, it was great. And so when Katrina hit, they sustained a little damage, and then, it was okay. Or, everybody, they had the drill. Everybody was sleeping in the hallways, and then they figured they had dodged the bullet, right? So this was the story I told, sort of setting the scene. And then Ben de Boisblanc. And then, of course, what happened was, in the early morning on Tuesday, several of the levees and flood walls failed. Okay, so we all know that happened. And many of the pumping stations that had removed some of the water ground to a halt because the electric lines went down. So suddenly the city is completely flooded. So here's the story. When Ben de Boisblanc, head of the IC unit on Charity's 12th floor, looked out the window shortly after daybreak, he saw the entire city was underwater. This is such a great scene to me, because it really says, he looks out and it's like, oh shit. Hundreds of terrified people were marooned on rooftops after using axes and hatchets to escape through attics when the rising waters engulfed them and the pockets of air ran out. I mean, that's totally chilling to me. I mean, think about that. You're suffocating, and you're trying to, that's when we knew we were in big trouble. So anyway, and then it sort of goes on from there. But these are the kinds of stories that you're looking for, because it really illuminates what you're talking about. So that's, going through what happened. Okay, then I sort of move over to Peter DeBlow, who was also at Charity Hospital. He was in the emergency room. And then I wrote, for 3 days, Charity Hospital, one of the biggest facilities in the country, had somehow fallen off the government's disaster management radar, and no help from FEMA or the National Guard arrived. On day 3 or 4, we were told at least twice, pack your bags, come in and get us, DeBlow recalled. And then they didn't. We heard on a portable radio that we had already been evacuated. That was priceless. Okay, so again, you have, sort of, these insights, and these quotes. All right, so then I sort of moved over to look at Billy. So you're pulling back, we're at Charity Hospital. What's sort of happening on the outside? And the problem, what was happening on the outside is that everything was down. There was no communication network whatsoever. You couldn't use it. Can you imagine? I can't even, whenever I write stories, I always try and, put myself in people's shoes so that when I write, I can sort of write from their perspective. Because as a journalist, that's who I am. I'm a conduit. I bear witness. I mean, the best kind of journalism does that. And I try and put myself in people's shoes, but I can't imagine this. I just can't imagine. No electricity. I mean, they needed, in the hospital, to communicate with each other, they had runners going up and down the stairs. The elevators didn't work. I mean, just basic, simple things that you don't think about. So anyway, I steered away from the police because, it was very controversial with the police, and I didn't want to get into that. I didn't want to touch it. But the firefighters were really, heroes, 100%, up and down, and most of the police, too, really were. But I did want to concentrate, so pulling back. I mean, they had no communication networks. Most fire and police stations were underwater. Dispatchers were unable to relay messages, and police and firefighters labored mightily to do their jobs under imaginably adverse conditions, often without adequate equipment or trucks, food and water, change of clothing, or a place to sleep. All right, and this I got directly from Billy. Okay, the entire New Orleans Fire Department established a base camp on the 4-acre campus of a small Catholic college in Algiers, across the bridge on the west bank of the Mississippi, which had escaped flooding, and firefighters remained there the next 6 weeks. Fire companies all over the city were told where to report by runners, since this was the only reliable means of communication. So here's another story, and like I said, I mean, Billy told me like 50 stories, and I had to, this whole chapter couldn't be about him, although it could have been, it would have been very entertaining. On Tuesday, a team of firefighters plowed through floodwaters to the St. Bernard projects to rescue people still stranded in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. It looked like a third world country, and people were floating by clinging to wood planks or ice chests. See, this is why Billy is so great, because he's very specific. You know, he's one of these people. I have a friend that I go walking with every Sunday, and she's the same way. I mean, they talk like writers, you know. She'll talk about going to a restaurant, you know, with floor ceiling brick and this and that. I mean, he painted a whole picture. You really can feel what it's like, and he's wonderful to quote. It looked like a third world country, we called Billy Shanks, a fire department captain. They began the arduous process of airlifting the old and the infirm on chappers able to land on a nearby bridge. Quote, this elderly blind woman with diabetes had her little 10-year-old granddaughter with her who was obviously her eyes. So, I'm writing about medical stuff, right? So I wanted it, this is the story I chose, because it was somebody who had chronic illness. This elderly blind woman with diabetes had her little 10-year-old granddaughter with her who was obviously her eyes, said Shanks. When we put her on the helicopter, the poor woman started crying for her granddaughter, so we put the little girl in her arms. That broke my heart. Later that night, driving down Magazine Street, a normally busy thoroughfare with antique stores, art galleries, and upscale boutiques, quote, it looked like the world had ended. Shanks recalled. It was pitch black and there wasn't a light on in the entire city. You see why he's old, right? I mean, he just talks, and, you know. So, anyway, all right, so, and then I sort of move on. Sergi Hossani was also just a wonderful source of information, and then I interviewed his girlfriend, too, Linda Wilson, to sort of get some pictures. So, inside the Superdome, the massive 27-story stadium in downtown, blah, 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 you know, that sheltered 30,000 refugees for 6 horrific days. It was utter anarchy. The sweltering, dusky air was steeped in sweat from exhausted, unwatched people who were starving, frightened, and dehydrated, and the stench from the overflowing toilets and huge piles of rotting trash baking outside in the sun. Food, water, and medicine were in scant supply, and some of those sought sanctuary from the 4-foot-high waters surrounding the 77,000-seat arena had arrived with just a shirt on their backs. Once inside the Superdome, they were trapped because armed guards wouldn't let them leave. It was like a war zone and very disorganized. The conditions were like something I'd seen in a remote region of Africa, said Dr. Syed Hossani. I couldn't believe this was America. I mean, these are really sort of priceless quotes, you know, really sort of illuminating. The physician and his girlfriend, Linda Wilson, had both been to graduate school in New Orleans. Wilson had just gotten her PhD at LSU, while Hossani completed a pathology residency at Tulane after years as a general surgeon in his native Italy. Warnings about the severity of the coming storm prompted them to leave in what was the first mandatory evacuation in the city's 300-year history. All right, now here's a quote from Linda Wilson that I included because it was incredibly chilling. The mayor came on TV around noon and said 20,000 body bags were being sent to New Orleans, and if you remain in the city, you need to write your name and your social security number on your body. I mean, what does that tell you? I mean, when she told me that, I mean, I just got goosebumps. I mean, that really, that's a warning, right? It was evidence something bad was coming our way. We left late Saturday afternoon, but we didn't take much except our dog. We had no clue we'd lose everything. They joined, and then this way I was able to use them as the spine of the story to talk about this massive evacuation. They joined more than 1.3 million people fleeing the city in much of South Louisiana in cars, U-Hauls, blah, 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 in the largest dislocation of American citizens since the Civil War. It's incredible. It took the couple nearly 8 hours crawling on the virtually gridlocked interstate to make the trek to Baton Rouge, which is about 80 miles upriver from New Orleans. The sleepy state capital doubled in size overnight with the arrival of 200,000 newcomers who booked every available hotel room, crowded into makeshift shelters or camped out in garages, hallways, and kitchens of extended families, friends, or the legions of good Samaritans like the local dentist and his family who took in Linda and Saeed. So you can see that I'm really trying to hammer home, I hope it's not the sledgehammer technique, that this happened to middle class people. These are the stories that you didn't see on the news. All right, when Hassani heard over the radio medical professionals were needed back in New Orleans, he contacted FEMA. They took him back to the Superdome. But he quickly discovered he was only one of 2 doctors. And I didn't get into this, but he told me the other doctor was disabled. I couldn't check it, so I just thought I'd leave that one alone. It's bad enough there was just 2 doctors. In a stadium filled with thousands of famished, thirsty, traumatized people roasting in 100-degree heat. He barely knew where to begin. At least 1,000 people were in terrible shape with serious health problems, uncontrolled diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, elderly people in wheelchairs with no medication. If people were scared if they went out in the street, they would be shot. Hassani did his best to treat them with scant supplies on hand, but he remains convinced people died because of negligence. There was truly nothing, no food, the arena had no lights, and you couldn't use the restroom. All right, and then I moved on, and I sort of went back to charity, and Peter DeBlow, because this is what you're looking for, is stories, 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 right? Peter DeBlow talked about this story where Wednesday night,
Give 20.
it's 22. 4:40, okay, oh God, I'm blabbing away here. Okay. All right, well, let me just finish this one story and then I'll talk about the other stuff. All right, but I think you're getting the drift, right? Is that you're looking for these dramatic stories. Peter DeBlow was talking about how they triage patients and they color-coded them. Black meant that you just, try and make them comfortable, but they probably weren't going to make it. But green and yellow, they were probably going to make it, and these people had gone through just heroic endeavors to try and keep these people alive. It was a nightmarish time as scarce resources and doctors operating under extraordinary pressures made controversial life and death decisions. DeBlow found out months later that many of the patients he thought could have been saved were reclassified as black once they arrived at the airport. We were devastated, he recalled. The physician that I had passed the patients off to at the airport came up to me at a conference and burst into tears. I'm so sorry, she told me over and over. We let you down. These are just chilling stories. Just incredible. All right, let me just move on to Felice. And I'm just kind of jumping ahead. I have about 25 stories with Billy, but I'll forget all those. But the way I ended the chapter is that Felice took us on a tour of the lower Ninth Ward, which was tremendous, to have her take us on that tour. And I talked about all the positive things that were going on in New Orleans and how the healthcare system has not only rebuilt itself, but it's sort of like in the vanguard now for dealing with emergencies and resiliency. But some wounds are never going to heal. And I sort of paint the picture of the fact that, Brad Pitt's building his houses there, and I'm not trying to, demean that in any way or denigrate it, but the area itself is this thriving, bustling community that really doesn't exist anymore. And then I'll just close with this quote. Most of these houses were completely underwater, said Wilma, pointing to the gutted lots that are now covered with vegetation. That was where my best friend's house was. It used to be so beautiful. And Fats Domino's house was over there. This is where my parents' house was, she said quietly, her eyes clouding over. Every Sunday I think about having dinner with my family after church, and then I remember that none of them are here. I can't keep track of all the people who died afterwards from the stress of the dissolution of families and the fragmentation. I went to a high school football game at my son's alma mater not long ago. He graduated in 2004. Everyone looked so old, and some people's hair had turned white. It was like a science fiction movie. This city is still packed with grief. So that is what I found. I did feel that. I felt a city 7 years later that was packed with grief. So anyway, you could see, I didn't go through the whole thing, but what I was looking for were dramatic stories, and people telling it in their own. There was a whole section in here from Ben de Boisblanc that he talks about, going running down at the lake Punch Train at 5:20 in the morning, and it's all feral dogs and wild pigs down there. And he said, I felt like it was Armageddon, and I was in one of those Armageddon movies. It was really very touching and poignant. But you understand what I'm talking about. Are there any questions? I'm going to get into interviewing techniques. What was the other thing that you asked me? Interviewing techniques, and what else?
Well, I kind of have a question. Given that so that's the chapter that where you're telling, or maybe there's other chapters where you're telling stories, but then you're also getting into more making your point about how people's health is affected by the climate change.
Yeah. How people's health is affected by the collapse of the public health system underneath, in this particular chapter, when you have an extreme weather event.
Yeah. I was just wondering about like when it starts being reviewed and that sort of thing, because it's a controversial topic. Does that worry you? I mean, there's going to be people who are just going to be like, well, that's not true, or they're just going to tear it apart. I would think because it's.
Well, I have to say, I'm sorry, what's your name? Elaine. I'm hoping that that's not going to happen. I mean, I would think that after this summer, that we have less climate change deniers in this country, and that by the time next summer comes around, I don't know. I don't know. I'll try. I have to be honest. I really don't want to get into a discussion as to why climate change is happening and whether it's real or not. I'd rather sort of, not here, but just sort of in general. I'd like to sort of move the discussion forward to the fact that this is happening. It's a serious threat to our health, all of us. There's this huge West Nile virus outbreak in Texas now. That's totally climate change related. And I have to, like I said, I have to go back and redo all my chapters because, the events have completely, overtaken it. And one of my chapters was on Australia because I wanted to do a portrait of what unrestrained climate change looked like. And I had to rewrite that chapter because we've got unrestrained climate change here in this country right now. We've got droughts, et cetera, et cetera. But I hope I don't have to get into it.
Sorry, I put that
No. Well, no, it's a very fair question.
I was also wondering about, and trying to keep this as close as possible to the point of storytelling. So one of my passions is doing away with pseudoscience and people misinterpret studies, or whether intentionally or otherwise, and that sort of thing. I guess I'm wondering, when you run across those things, how do you deal with that? Or, have you ever felt pressure from someone who's commissioned you to do an article to, kind of gloss over stuff? Or, I just wanted to, because it's personal interest of mine, I know it's not completely in line with what we're talking about.
Maybe we can talk afterwards, because we're sort of running out of time.
Okay.
Do people have other questions?
The only question I have in this, obviously we have a lot of research, on our end here, but when you're doing an interview, are you also checking the facts that they're telling you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's a lot of work, okay.
Yes. Yeah, no, really, it's like I said, I'm doing a chapter right now on water, and this friend of mine did a long series on Las Vegas, and Pat Mulroy, who's the water commissioner, and she told me this great story about Pat Mulroy, and it was so juicy. but I can't use it, because it's her recording, and I don't have time to go record it, but yeah, I do, I double check, as much as I can, because there's a limit, but yes, no, it is a lot. As I told Billy and his wife, I asked everybody the same question. And if 4 or 5 people tell me the same thing, then I have a pretty good feeling that that's probably, true. Okay. Any questions? No more questions? Okay. All right, let me just talk about interviewing techniques just a little bit. How much time do we have, Nick? 10 minutes? Okay. I have a little handout on interviewing techniques, but I didn't. Let's see, where is I had a whole thing on interviewing. Okay. All right, how I find people, I talked about that, right? Newspapers, magazines, books, the internet, email blasts, social networks like Facebook and LinkedIn. Tremendous. You guys have no idea. You just don't. Really, I was like hysterical. I thought, oh my God, I'm leaving in 2 weeks and I don't have any real voices. And I sent out that email blast. Within about 2 days, I just had all these incredible people. Okay, all right, some basic interviewing techniques. I used to teach a whole class on interviewing, but if somebody asks me what is the most important interviewing skill, I would say it is the ability to do what? Who said what?
Listen.
Listen, yeah, actively listen. And I have to tell you that, interviewing is extremely tiring. It may not seem that way because you think, you're just chatting. You're not chatting. You're sitting there intently listening to this person and keeping your mouth shut, because you want them to talk, and you're, filing away in your mind, where you want to go back, maybe taking little notes here and there, where you want to go back and fill in the blanks and stuff. So a key interviewing technique is asking open-ended questions. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about, what happened. Tell me about what sticks in your mind most about that day. Tell me about, and then let them answer the question. And then listen. And you have to go back and probe to get people to elaborate further. And Billy was, he would just talk. And then when I said to, write down the story, huge pieces would be missing. Was this Tuesday or Wednesday? Where was this? This and that, because you have to get, because, part of what I think makes a good story work is specificity, right? Like the elderly woman, with the 10-year-old daughter, who is her eye. That's what sticks with you. For my editor, she's read some of the early chapters, and she told me that the thing that stuck in her mind the most out of all of this, she hasn't read the Katrina chapter yet, was some woman had gone to Phoenix to think about relocating, was looking at houses, and she got this dust-borne disease that almost killed her. And she said that really, but it's that kind of specificity. I had the woman, looking at, in these planned communities, and, I had her Lottie dying around, and you can really relate to that, right? And so it's that kind of specificity, but you have to go back to do that. The other thing about interviews, just an hour or an hour and a half is usually it. After that, everybody gets tired. I remember years and years and years ago, I interviewed this woman for a Good Housekeeping story I did, and we ended up talking for 4 hours just because it had to be done that way. I came home and went right to bed, and she did too. She called, she was friends with my friend who I was staying with. She called up my friend. She said, I don't know what your friend did to me, but I'm exhausted. I have to go to sleep. That kind of thing. The other thing is, and this is from journalism, but I don't know if this applies to you. Sometimes I do Q&A type interviews, with sort of experts. Like I got to interview Elizabeth Blackburn, who won the Nobel Prize. And she was really, truly wonderful. And if you have a choice between doing 2 interviews an hour apiece or 1 interview for 2 hours, do the 2 interviews for an hour. because when you come back the next day, they know you, and they're more comfortable with you, and you get much better stuff. When I interviewed Elizabeth Blackburn, I had interviewed her when I was at the Times, but I interviewed her in person for Discover, and the first day, she's a very kind of formal, she's very shy. She's one of those people that's pathologically shy. And she was very kind of formal the first day. But the second day, I guess she thought about it, and she decided she liked me, whatever. But she let her hair down, and she literally is the funniest person I've ever interviewed. I mean, and who knew, that this telomere expert, who won a Nobel Prize in chemistry, would be like that. So, these are some other pointers and stuff. I can't think of anything else to part with you. This is at 4 o'clock. Go ahead.
When you're interviewing someone like Billy, who just is a great storyteller and can go on any number of subjects, do you ever ask your questions in such a way that kind of keep him on point, or do you just let him ramble?
I let him ramble, because you never know where they're going to go, and it's all this wonderful stuff, and then I will go through my notes and I'll go back, and sort of say, okay, Billy, when was this? Where was this? When did this happen? And get all the, sort of foundation kind of materials. But, that's something, your name is? Courtney. Courtney, that's something that you sort of learn over time, and I've learned to just let people go, and I've always felt like the best kind of, and I'm talking about journalism now, is immersion. Like when I was in New Orleans, I ran around and I tried to talk to as many people as I could. Only half of them made it into the chapter. But again, to sort of get back to your question, but I really felt like I could write about this stuff with authority because I really kind of immersed myself in it. The chapter on Australia, I was there for 3 weeks. And, you never know. I always feel, I don't know if they have this anymore, but when I was a kid, we used to have this thing called supermarket sweepstakes. And you'd win a supermarket sweepstake, and you'd be able to run around in your favorite supermarket for 5 minutes and fill up the supermarket basket with everything, right? And that's what I always feel like when I go on these reporting trips. It's like supermarket sweepstakes. I throw everything in there, and then I go home and I go, these glasses are a size large. I mean, I don't really need these, But, you kind of go through and you see what works. I did a whole section on mental health, and that ended up not going into the story. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, conversely, when you have someone who is giving monosyllabic answers and isn't as natural as storyteller, do you just kind of cut your losses and find someone else to interview, or
Yes.
do you just rephrase your questions and try?
Well, it depends upon how critical they are. Like with Robert Kahn, he was my interview. I had flown to, Washington to interview him, and he was on the interview that month. So we get back, we get what we have, and my editor and I made it work. But, normally, unless somebody's utterly critical, you just find somebody else. But don't be unkind, because they kind of know, because people want to be in, and I feel bad, if I can't include them. But, so you be nice about it. Always be polite, always, because people are giving you their time. But, yeah, because there's a million other people out there that, so. I can't think of it. I hope this was useful to you guys. Is there any other questions?